Hey everyone, welcome to today's episode of our podcast, Decisions Now. I am your host, Erin Pearson, alongside my co-host, Rigvi Chavala. Today we are very excited. We have Ben Waber here, who is the president and co-founder of Humanyze. So welcome, Ben.
Thanks so much for having me.
One of the things I think that's really cool about what we have kind of teed up for today is we've been talking a lot in other podcasts about how do you use like domain specific AI to and really like build a foundation of that and why it's essential. But Ben, one of the things that you're doing with Humanyze is really applying it specifically within like people analytics and behavioral analytics as well. So really drilling into the foundation of what that is and what does it mean for businesses and how they, once they have that foundation, how they can actually act upon it as well. So just to start off with, do you mind just kind of explaining what like people and behavioral analytics are?
Sure. Yeah, that'd probably be helpful. I mean,
I was thinking that it would be good to have.
that's right. That's right. Yeah, no, at a basic level, the idea behind these kind of analytics is to try to use data about how people interact and collaborate at work. You can think about, email, chat, meeting data, but also sensor data about the real world. Really using all the systems that we use to work generate so much information about how work happens. And, what we try to do is figure out, well, what patterns from that really matter when it comes to understanding, performance, retention, what have you, but really at a macro level, right? I would argue the individual level is it for a whole variety of reasons, which we can get into, is less of an appropriate unit of analysis. But really looking more at, what are the macro patterns, that most businesses, again, like have no idea what's going on internally from this perspective, right? Like how much does the marketing team talk to the leadership team, right? Like nobody knows. Even how many hours people work, right? And you think about how simple those questions are, but of course also how critical they are, right? And the reason that companies can't answer them is they don't have the data, but of course they actually do have the data. And the idea is that once you have, that data at its core, you can start to ask questions about, well, what drives the outcomes we care about, and then as we make management decisions, either based on this data or not, but just the question, of course, is always how does that change how people work, and then being able to use that to very quickly iterate on how we work, on how we manage, and again, so the benefits of this this approach of people analytics and workplace analytics, it is yes in terms of initially being able to make better decisions, but I'd argue it's probably even more valuable just to be able to say very, very quickly, hey, this decision didn't work out. This strategy isn't working. Let's try something else. And to be able to quickly experiment and iterate. And again, I think what's fundamentally new over time is that this data, if you went back 30 years, really wasn't available. And now you can't say it's unknowable, how much two divisions talk to each other. Like, no, you can measure it. You might not have done it before, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't have measured it. Like you absolutely should.
Absolutely. In fact, Erin and I were just talking about hallway conversations before you joined. And it's, to your point, 30 years ago, you would still track it, but it's anecdotal, right? And now it's all virtual, digital. You have so many forms of communication. If I just reflected on one of our previous conversations, we started off with general AI and narrow AI and kind of went down that rabbit hole, right? But recently, I also heard about a nice categorization in AI where there are document-based AI and then people-based AI, which to me, when I was reading about Humanyze and when we talked early, the data or the information that's generated by people is quite different from the structured kind of documents
That's true.
So it's a different, I'd say, a subsegment, and it's a harder problem to crack, right? So I was pretty curious how you guys at Humanyze are doing that.
Yeah. So this is the thing: is that computers are very good at understanding certain classes of data and very bad at understanding other classes of data. And they're just inappropriate. They're just this kind of data and these AI or machine learning algorithms in general. Like they're appropriate for some problems. They're, in my view, not appropriate for every problem. Like they're a tool, right? But when it comes to people data, to sort of your point, it's something where a lot of the standard tools, that AI has used over the years are. It's not that you can't use them, but you just have to be very, very cautious about how you apply them because ultimately, when you're looking at this kind of data, there's so much of it. I mean, this is true in general, right? But you're trying to predict a very specific thing in our case. For example, like let's say I want to predict the employee attrition levels of a particular department. If you just said, show me something that can predict that, right? Without any constraints. I mean, I can find something that predicts it like extremely accurately, but is it real? Is it actionable? Like that's always the question. That's always the question. Because the difference here, of course, is these predictions that need to be acted on by people. You can't, I mean, nor actually should you try to make this like a totally automated people-related management system, because you're ultimately going to miss a whole lot of context about what's going on. But what that means is you have to do a lot of work up front. I mean, fortunately, there's decades of research in social science about what things matter. Now, the difference is that those weren't operationalized as much, right? They were very subjective around, hey, manager interaction matters. Okay, well, what does that mean? Let's actually say, like, how do we quantify that? And then let's actually see if it matters. And again, we can use all the tools from AI and machine learning to really see what matters in this context. You can see how that changes over time. You can, learn with those patterns. Absolutely. Like that is the right way to do it. But making sure that you are, casting an appropriate net, right? And not just going fishing, because not only will you almost certainly make, poor predictions, but more importantly, it will be much less understandable to people who have to use these predictions to make decisions. And I think that's, we've done a lot of work to make sure that these, analytics are validated, that that they are predictive in a wide variety of circumstances, but again, not in 100% of circumstances. And so even with those, again, really just making sure like this is a tool to use to, help make those better decisions. But, ideally our customers combine that, and they all do at this point, but combine their contextual knowledge of the business, which we can't capture, right? Like computers are not smart enough to understand that like at all. But computers can do a lot of things, and algorithms can do things really well around understanding these macro patterns and those changes in ways that humans can't. But it's a combination of those things. I think when it comes to management in particular, that's extremely powerful.
So, Ben, I have a question about that though. So when we talk about AI quite a bit, there's a lot of like big data that you need to go behind it to really build up what are these algorithms to give it give it a data set to learn from. So when you are setting this up for different companies, how are you actually, or how long does it take to build up enough data? And how do you see the patterns change then over time? Because there's certainly examples historically about using data that has some like racism built into it as an example. So
probably,
how
like,
do you make sure that doesn't get a bias put into what you're doing?
Yeah. No. I mean, so here's the thing. So first of all, there's always bias in data, always. And no matter how much work you do to try to remove it or minimize it, things will still exist that you don't know about. And so what that means is that you're never done looking for those things. And sort of, even if you have a model that looks pretty good, periodically, and pretty frequently, you need to keep reviewing that, at least in my view. Seeing like, where are your holes? Because there are going to be holes and you just aren't aware of them.
Sure. Yeah.
Right. In terms of getting these, algorithms to appropriate levels of predictive power with enough data. Because again, obviously, when it comes to AI in general, what's really changed over the years is two things. Like the actual predictive algorithms we use are like unchanged mostly from like 30, 40 years ago, right? The difference is that the amount of data we have is unprecedented. And, now we can train these larger models on larger amounts of data because computers are faster, right? Like that's basically it, right? So it's not like we're doing, like we can pretend we're doing rocket science, right? But it's more like it's the data that's the big difference. I mean, again, compute matters, but like the data is, from my perspective, the much more interesting thing. And so, yes, I think to your point, there is, at this point we have, at least at Humanyze and even back in my academic work, right? Like an awful lot of data. And we have the largest multi-platform data set on workplace interaction in the world. So we have this large sort of background to draw on like, here are the classes of things that should matter. To your point, then you go to a specific company and you're applying that model to a specific company. So the question is, are they predictive in the same way, right? Here are the ones that could be predictive, but some won't be. And so you want a certain amount of data. Now, what we do is we start pulling data historically to sort of seed some of these models. I always tell our customers be cautious about that though, right? Because if you start to go beyond just the way that data is retained, think about email as an example, right? Now imagine I send you an email and I'm like, hey, do you want to meet at 2:00? And let's say I sent you an email like that 5 years ago, right? There's actually still social information in that email, but like maybe you deleted it, right? Which is understandable. But the question is, does that data still exist? If it doesn't exist, then it's not saying you couldn't look at data 5 years ago. You can, but it's going to be noisier. You're going to be missing more. And so it's going to be that data is going to be a lot more incomplete. And so you have to be more cautious. What we like to do is, when you collect moving forward, that's when you can feel a lot more confident, because then we capture essentially 100% of what comes out of those systems. But most of the times, companies haven't looked at those behavioral data in the past, and so we can't do that. In terms of looking for bias and things like that, there's a couple things. I mean, we have pretty standard processes that I think, everyone should do. I mean, not just within companies, but, more broadly looking at, do you see things that are, tend to be correlated with different demographic groups or things like that? And you need to know those things. You can try to correct for those. But the other important point for us is, like, it's always, again, there's always going to be holes, and we're never going to have 100% of the data about work, right? So I'll just use a simple example. Imagine that older employees are more likely to use text messages, personal text messages, for work. I don't think that's true, accurate, but, like, imagine it's true. It could be true. I'm sure there's some companies where it is true. We would never know it, never know it. And so we do things where we survey a subset of, the employee base and our customers to try to figure out what tools they use that we just don't know. Like, one of our customers, for example, all the engineers were, like, it's a 300,000 person company. In the whole engineering division, they were all on Slack. But initially, we didn't get Slack data. And we knew this going in because we had, we talked to people, but also we surveyed people and said, hey, you know what? That's a hole in the data. So you have to be very, very cautious about, any of our analytics that have anything to do with engineering. Like, you're going to have to be very cautious about that because we just don't have that data yet. Now, eventually we got that data, right? But that there's going to be things like text messages where we're just never going to know that. And so you have to keep checking for things like that. But again, that would mean you're going to be systematically biased. For example, in the example I gave about, like, the old people, right? Like, older people would be systematically biased against in the data, not because they work even necessarily differently. They just use different tools that mean that some of that data is missing from our system. And so, again, you're always going to miss things like that. And just, it's not saying you ignore these analytics or ignore these predictions. No, you should use them. But just make sure that people who would have that information and know that context, right? Like, again, you need to combine that contextual knowledge with these predictions, because I think you're just going to come up with better decisions and do things, I think, a lot more ethically as well.
Sure. So no matter how good the algorithm is, you still need the human curation on top of it, because they understand the context or in this case, in this example, the holes in the data that they can then apply.
Yep.
Yeah. In fact, it's the three-pronged approach, right? You need data, like Ben said.
Yes.
There are innovative ways to kind of make sure your algorithms restrict the bias. You probably can't eliminate it, but you could attenuate it. That's an engineering term.
At least for things that you know about. Like,
exactly,
again,
right,
I always want to, like, you can do it for things you know about, and you should absolutely do that, right?
Yeah.
But just, like, you're right. The important thing is, like, there's definitely something you're missing. You just don't know what it is. Like, and also, the other point I want to make, though, right, is what if there is, for example, in a company, like, let's say there's only one Native American woman in the whole company. You will never, it is impossible to know if you're, like, literally impossible. It is mathematically impossible to know that your metrics are biased against that person. You would never know because there's only N of one, right? And so the small number thing actually really does matter when it comes to, especially discrimination, because you think about historically underrepresented groups, like, it's in the name, right? There's fewer of them, which means there's less data, right, that exists. And so, again, the tools of data science are not helpful in those cases. Like, there's other tools you have to bring to the fore to try to figure out what are the implications for those groups. And it's hard. It's super hard, right? But, like, my view, it's like you're creating this capability. It's a responsibility of you to work on that.
Right. And to your point, right, it is hard, and for the things that are known, right? So I was recently reading a paper from University of Maryland, and they were looking at resume filtering, right? Which, again, kind of the HR function, a lot of companies use it. There's a natural bias because the people who train the model have already kind of scaled that bias into it. So what they did was they changed the algorithm to factor for that. And, I think one of the examples they had for the ratio was it's an inverse ratio for the TF-IDF algorithm. And essentially, they're taking the ratio that goes the opposite way, right? So if you have a term repeated 20 times, but in 45 documents, 45 resumes from Malaysia, right? Then they take that and say, oh, this is a Malaysian thing. and it's biased
Yeah.
towards that region, so they account for that, right? So there are ways. To your point, it's hard.
Yeah.
It's like this is specific to resume filtering, right? But then you
Yeah.
go into more complex problems. It's it's a complex, further complex thing. But then the third part that I was going to mention is what you touched on earlier. Is it's the data, it's the algorithms, but then it's also people coming back and retraining the algorithm. So the awareness that there is going to be a bias eventually, and that you correct it or course correct it over time.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
like
you're never done. Again, I think
yeah.
like which people don't like, right? They're like, I want to do this step, like I want to do a debiasing step and then be done. Like I understand,
It's
like
right.
it would be really nice if we could do that, but it's not possible. It's just not possible,
Yeah.
unfortunately. Yeah.
Oh, that's cool. But Erin, I guess we use, if you remember, our HR team internally uses a bot, right? That we interact with on a regular basis.
I just hit my 6
Oh,
month
there you
mark.
go.
And this week I got a bot notification.
Okay, and so that is a good example for us to predict, right? Employee engagement, and at least in my group, we've noticed opportunities to speak to people before they decide to quit, like decide to quit, not quit, right?
Yeah.
So it's much more helpful for us to have that mechanism in place. This is HR, but it could be in other areas within the organization. I mean, Erin, I guess question for you is, have you heard or seen in your interactions with your colleagues and customers any other, like within HR domain, or because Humanyze is there, because we're exploring all these use cases, anything else that comes to mind?
So I think the bot is a good example of it, but I think Ben, you've provided some like pretty interesting examples of what people are doing as well. I haven't worked specifically within the HR space, so I'm not, I wouldn't be as privy to the examples, I suppose. Though I think the engineering one in particular was really on point, because certainly when you work with a lot of engineering teams, you're typically in a more technical environment, or they're doing a lot of comments in Jira or like another workflow tool. And that's absolutely part of the interaction, let alone all like the cool little comments that people make in code bases, that if you really want to get involved in somebody's website or an application, you can read through that and see what kind of mood they were in.
It is interesting that, although I'd argue content analysis on these things, I'd argue is quite, I proceed with caution for a variety of reasons. And interestingly, if we look at because again, we were doing this for our PhD, I actually assumed things like content analysis within internal communication would matter for predicting like performance or retention. Like I assumed that. It's not to say it has no predictive power, like it does. It's like 5 to 10% lift over some of these network effects, right? But again, as you can imagine, in large organizations especially, right? Like if management and the marketing team only communicate once a month, like who cares what they talk about? The bigger thing is they barely communicate, right? And those effects dominate at large scales. So rather than getting into, the privacy issues, the legal issues, frankly, with looking at that kind of, like, just in my view, it's like it's not worth it in those, at least in those scenarios, right? But again, when you have these kind of analytics, so you think about every people decision a company makes, and I use the term quite broadly. You talk about workplace strategy. So where do people work, right? How often we go into the office? How often, can we work from home? What does that look like? Do we go to co-working spaces? Obviously a big part of how that should be driven is driven by like, well, how does that change how people work? Because fundamentally, it's a management tool if you think about workplace. So the question is, though, what is the effect? And that's what we can measure. But then you also look at things like what org chart do we have, what processes, what training programs, and all those things get down to, well, how does it change how we work, how we collaborate? And so there's so much there. I mean, again, you can look at that very broadly, at least for the sort of work I do, where I think that there's applications. I mean, of course, of AI, within organizations, more broadly, already brought up algorithmic hiring, and sort of resume screening and things like that. And obviously, there's been a lot of focus on those areas as well. Again, I would say, like, I think these are good technologies. It's a good approach, but ideally, you still have a human in the loop for these things, because even with being able to correct for biases, essentially what you think about doing when you introduce some of these systems, and this includes ours, right? Like, you can reduce bias on like from a single person, but essentially what you're doing is taking a single bias and scaling it up, right? So like just think about like hiring is interesting, right? So like let's say I apply to a job at company X and they decide to not hire me, right? That doesn't affect me from applying to company Y, right? Like I could still apply to company Y, and if it's for the same title, I mean obviously the fact that I didn't get another job indicates I'm going to be less likely to get it, but like it doesn't directly impact that. Now, if you imagine that everyone uses the exact same hiring algorithm, right, which is going to have the exact same biases, right? It might be provably like lower than anything, but because people have different biases, right? Like person X being biased in this way and person Y being biased in that way, again, will lead to different outcomes. And so just this idea, and there's great work by Catherine Creel out of Stanford who's looking at these issues. And again, like how should you structure the technology as well as the use of it, right? So I think there's two things. It's not to say that, if you get 1,000 resumes for a single job opening, like you can't look at them all, right? So like, I'm not saying the technology is bad. The technology is useful, but just people, need to realize that like even doing the debiasing work, I'd argue it's still not quite enough, right? Like there's still more work you got to do. And I think a lot of people think about AI as this sort of like, magic tool that like it'll, you don't need people anymore to do these things. And I think it can make a lot of what people do, or arguably most of what people do, a lot better. And we can start to focus our energies on things that are more worth our while. Like, again, you can imagine these resume scoring things, right? Like maybe I use a couple different algorithms and then that screens things out. Or maybe like I will spend more time on the ones that are rated high, but like it'll flag certain places for me to look on, again, the longer discussion on these points. But I think this idea of like humans are good at certain things that just algorithms are really bad at, and will continue to be bad at for probably our whole lifetimes. But like the combination of what we're good at with what computers are good at is incredibly powerful, and we can do so, but the process there, it's beyond just a single technology. It's that process of adoption that I think is really the key.
I think that takes us right back also to like AI algorithms. Technology is really here to make like a human's life easier. And there's like a big misconception that AI is going to take over the world, it's going to take over all the jobs, very sci-fi-esque mindset. And it's really kind of there to make your life like almost like it's absolutely more enjoyable. It's to help you make things more scalable, to reduce those repetitive tasks. And so people can actually focus on what matters. And that's like cultivating the interactions and really using it to go forward, but to eliminate all of the noise from what people are doing. Something I would be fascinated to hear, Ben, is do you have any favorite story from the clients that you've worked with about something that they learned from looking at the data?
Yeah, so I will bring this up. And I will also say, I'll just point this out, right, that sometimes just the data validating what your hypothesis already was, like that's a good thing. Like that means what was going on, right? Like that's good. So it doesn't always like just, sometimes people are like, oh, what's the most surprising thing? Like, tell me something surprising about my company. I'm like, if I'm telling you lots of surprising things about your company, like it means you have no idea what you're doing, like literally no idea. So like you probably don't want that. Maybe one, but there are always some interesting things that come out. And so, all right, so one of them that does stick out that I just like was one of our customers, which is a very large technology company. And one of the things you can do, and sort of Erin, you're sort of describing this when you're talking about Jira data, but even code data, right? There's actually lots of good research, even beyond what we've done, that, for example, if my code depends on your code and we don't communicate, that's where the bugs pop up. It'll actually take us 32% longer to complete code if we don't communicate and we have a dependency, right? So there's lots of, it's actually interesting. It's not even just code. Other papers have shown this in like legal briefs. Like if we're writing the same part of the brief, we better talk. In aircraft engine design, lots of stuff, right? So anything with dependencies, you need to communicate. And so this technology company, we have all their dependency data. We also have all their communication data. But we also know when that communication happens. And even for this company, for actually people in their headquarters, we even had face-to-face communication data because they had, sort of these Bluetooth IDs that enabled us to estimate face-to-face interaction. Right? And so looking at that data, you can start to see, well, like what, for the teams and for the people who had the fewest bugs, like what do they do differently? Because that's the question, right? You start to look at that data and you see something really weird, which was that a lot of the interaction between teams that had lots of dependencies but weren't but didn't like sit very close to each other, like in the office, like literally sit very close to each other. Like a lot of that interaction happened between 12 and 1 p.m. Right, that's where like over 80% of that interaction happened. But you had different groups. So you had some groups that were very high performing, and they had a lot of interaction during that time, 12 to 1. Like 12 to 1, the groups that had the fewest bugs, the most communication with these other teams, had a lot of communication between 12 and 1, and they were the highest performers. And then the lowest performers had very little communication between 12 and 1, right? But what was weird though was that if you actually zoomed into it more, this low performing group between 12 and 1, they would almost every single day they would talk to exactly 3 other people. It's almost always 3, and sometimes it was 2. It was almost never more than 3. Right? You look over months, that's still what you see, which is weird, right? And then you look at this higher performing group. You see almost every day those people talk to 11 other people, and it was like exactly 11, and sometimes it was 10, but like it never went above 11, and like, you're just like, this is really weird, like really weird. Like it was these artificial like cliffs. It's very spiky. So you're like, what's going on here? Like, and again, these groups that had talked to a lot more people were like a lot more effective, like through the whole week, right? And so then you go to the cafeteria and you see what's going on. All right, so there's 2 set of doors. This is big cafeterias, 2 set of doors. 1 set of doors, but by those doors, all the tables had 12 seats. By the other set of doors, all the tables were smaller and had 4 seats. So what's happening is that people, like when you first join this company, I guess you had like a normal way you go to the cafeteria, and then you get into the cafeteria and you sit near the doors you go through. And if you sit at a table with some other people, you are very likely to communicate with them in general, right? And also interestingly, when you eat lunch with someone, you're much more likely to talk to them later in the week, like significantly more likely, right? Again, because you're like, oh yeah, I remember I can talk to person A about that thing, right? They sort of, gain visibility for you. And so essentially you were seeing, just to be clear, you're talking about like a 10+% difference in completion rates for code, which is like very high, like this is very expensive stuff, right? From the size of lunch tables, right? And so you think about it, you're like, is the CEO agonizing over the size of lunch tables? No, they were just like, whatever, it seems fine, it looks nice, put those 4-seat tables over there. But it significantly changed how people were working. And I think this is just, it's a broadly interesting thing about physical space that we see again and again and again, right? That I used to think, just to be clear, like this stuff didn't matter. That like, hey, I can email anyone, right, in the world, like, so who cares where I sit? But actually, if you sit next to someone, you actually email them more as well. Like there's some weird things that happen. And again, even when you look at like the data I just described, like, yeah, you show that with face-to-face data, but you can show the same patterns with, like, if I ate with them in lunch physically, I am much more likely to chat with them over like Slack, for example, later in the week. So you see the same sort of patterns, right? And just, again, thinking about the physical workplace as a tool, right? Like it's a tool to change how people work, right? Do you want certain things to happen more? It's easy to do that physically. It's harder to get those same changes, remotely through things like just Slack only. That doesn't mean you can't do it. It's possible.
Yeah, it's not just not on the top of your mind. Yeah. That's fascinating. That's an amazing story.
Yeah. So actually, I was at an event this week, and one of the things that one of the sales reps had said, who started their career during the pandemic, so they've never really interacted with many people, save for, every 6 months you have like one small event or something. But it was the first time actually interacting with the prospects that they were going after as well. And it, I think, made like a massive difference in just like breaking down this barrier of really understanding. Like it's one thing to be told, here's what somebody's pain points are, here's what they're interested in, here's what their role is. But when you actually meet them, and there was a puppy corner as well, and like you could just see all of like these people interacting with puppies, and it's like,
wait, so this was a literal pup, like they literally
it was
had
literally
all right,
I saw the pictures.
That sounds awesome. That sounds awesome. I'm game. Yeah.
So you had all these puppies, and it just like created this difference of before when you're doing everything digitally,
Yeah.
it's just a bunch of like titles and phone numbers that you're trying
Yeah.
to do and like written down pain points, and everybody's really the same and like kind of scary because they're kind of an enigma really. And then all of a sudden you start meeting these people in person, you have just like broken down that wall, and now you're just like, wow, everyone's actually a human and I can talk to them like a human.
Yeah. I mean, it's just easier to do, like, and one of my co-founders, our chief scientist, like actually her thesis was on this, that, for example, face-to-face meeting dynamics are significantly different than things that are virtual. There are ways you can change it. And I guess, but it's hard. It's hard and it takes effort, right? And again, like what I like to say is, it's not to say it's not possible to have the same dynamics remotely. It is. It's just, if you don't tell me anything else about a company and you say this company is like, they're going to work remotely more often, what's going to happen? And I'll say, well, you'll probably have fewer weak ties, right? It's probably going to happen, right? And again, a lot of the things you're bringing up, like they're likely to happen. And even companies that think they're doing it well, I would just encourage them to validate it with actual data, right? Because otherwise, like, you could feel fine, right? And this is what's interesting, actually. During the pandemic, when we looked at it in our data, if people went to work remotely, like, what are the things that changed? And again, some of them were things that I would have thought pre-pandemic. A lot of them, actually, I was surprised by a number of things as well, right? Like, there's actually significantly more communication across different levels of the hierarchy, by like about 26%, when people work remotely, which is interesting, right? Like, I wouldn't have expected that at all. I think, theoretically, the way I like to think about it is the most likely explanation is that the social cues in a physical office that say, like, hey, I'm the CEO, don't talk to me, right? Like, I'm on a separate floor, I have a private office or whatever, those don't exist, right? Virtually. So that's a good thing. So again, if like your company needs more, cross-level collaboration, then remote can be a very useful tool. On the flip side, though, again, significantly fewer weak ties, and these are people that, again, we could talk about exactly how we define it in the data. The idea is that these are people, like, think about someone you're in a 1 hour, 4-person meeting with them once a week, right? Like, there's someone but like you're not super close to. And those ties fell off a cliff. Those are down by more than 20% when people work remotely. And those things are critical for milestone attainment in large projects, for creativity. So again, if you need more of that, in general, physical office is good for that, right? But again, it's general. Like, even in our data, like, some companies are different, and you see that. But that is what is just likely to happen in general. And so I think we feel very emotional about these workplace decisions, which is understandable. But I think on top of that, just trying to say, all right, well, what are we trying to do, right? Like, what are we trying to achieve in terms of how we work? And that I do think, Erin, maybe to your point, during the pandemic was also weird because we couldn't use events as a tool to generate face-to-face interaction. And there actually is a lot of very interesting research, for example, that, like, if a team that works remotely on a project together, if they meet in person at the start of the project, their dynamics are significantly different than if they don't do that, right? So that as a tool, right, wasn't really used during the pandemic for obvious reasons, but now is something we could use. And so theoretically, I actually am very interested in this idea of, like, do people mostly work remotely, but then there's actually a lot more frequent, like, events, like maybe once a month, there's like a thing, right? Like, that's interesting. But, and I think we can think very creatively about these things, but, humans did evolve for, hundreds of thousands, millions of years to interact face to face. So we're pretty good at that. And I've yet to see data from from a technological platform that replicates those things. I'm not saying it's not possible. Like, hey, eventually we have the matrix and we can do it, right? But like, It appears that we're not there yet. I mean, there are some intriguing things like Gather Town, if people have seen that, or Spatial, which try to replicate some aspects of face-to-face environments.
Oh,
Are
you have
interesting.
metaverse now.
Metaverse,
Too.
omniverse.
I don't want to say it. I am. Okay, what does that mean? How is it different? We don't have to get into it. Maybe. I don't know.
The tangent.
Show me the data. Show me the data.
It'll take us years to evolve.
Yeah. All right. Okay, but yeah, well, we can get into it. There's intriguing things about those environments too, right? Like, different than a physical environment, I can make a rule that you can't talk to the CEO, and it'd be physically impossible. You can do this in Slack as well, right? It's any digital system, right? I could make a rule saying that frontline employees have no visibility to the CEO. I could do it, right? So that's interesting. You can make algorithms that could do that could make that likely. You can shape these things automatically, right? Which is incredibly powerful, right? When you think about you can do the things there that you can't do in the physical world. And I think those are interesting tools. But I think really we haven't started to grapple with ethically, like who should have the authority to do that, right? And because then you sort of ossify power structures as they exist today, both within organizations and across organizations, which is probably not a great thing. So you got to be very, very careful about that. But yeah.
Well, Ben, I think we're a little bit low on time here today, but I did have one last question for you because I just like to end on more of a personal question.
Sure.
So you wrote a book called
Yeah.
People Analytics, and I wanted to know, what was your biggest takeaway from two things? One, from the research that you did on the book, and then two, the actual process of writing itself.
Oh, okay. For the research, so a lot of the book was sort of different parts of my thesis combined together. So I'd already done some of the work for that. So I think some of the original research that I had to do for the book was a lot of it was on sort of historically how organizations developed, like how we work changed. And I guess what was really interesting to me was that if you think about human society and how work has evolved, the period from, let's say, the Industrial Revolution to today is incredibly abnormal, right? Like if you think about, so the vast majority of human history, like how did people work, right? Well, we lived in like small villages, right? And so it's essentially your neighbors or your coworkers, right? Like you knew each other very, very well, which meant you could respond very quickly to small changes in facial expression in terms of even how people talk. But that even after that, right? Not even just when people were in villages, but even, as humanity got more advanced and we, for example, if you wanted to be a blacksmith, right? Like how did you do that? Well, you had an apprenticeship. You lived with a blacksmith for like 5 years to learn that trade. So again, strong relationships driving those careers. But then the Industrial Revolution, sort of people assumed that it was, economically desirable to treat people as cogs in a machine, right? And again, you could then create organizations larger than anything in human history, like by far, right? And that's interesting, but again, that's sort of still how we treat people today, right? Like imagine you have a software developer. The implicit assumption is that you could fire that software developer and hire another one with the exact same title and that they're the same, which is of course incorrect. Today, what we produce, it's not so much like a physical cog, even if, and again, the question is, was it ever that? Right? But we're producing more and more knowledge, and I don't care, you could be a construction worker, and actually, yes, you're producing a physical building, but it's the interfaces between different things that are now even more complex than they were before, right? And so essentially, a big part of what organizations produce are actually the networks that they have internally and how we work. And that in that view, like again, people are very clearly not replaceable. They're not equivalent. And we sort of like implicitly know this. But the challenge has been that we haven't actually been able to show that, right? And so it sort of was interesting as I was doing the research, this idea that a lot of what humans are very good at and how our culture and our biology literally developed are actually to set us up for this way of working, which is about building trust, which is about communicating tacit information in a very quick way. And we're actually very, very good at that. And so I'm very bullish on that part of the equation. I think the issue is, of course, the way we manage, over the past, couple of 100 years has not geared towards that. And so we sort of need to get back to the scale is still very important for what we do. And so there are lessons we have to take, obviously, from, management over the last couple 100 years, but there are other things we need to bring back in. And I think that was very interesting to me to think about and to learn. As far as writing the book itself, writing the first draft was enjoyable and was like a nice process. I hated editing, hated it. Like the book is much better. The issue was the cadence on editing was just punishing. It just got to the point where it hit a deadline that I was going through the entire book like in a single day. It was awful. So write my next book, I am doing it on my timeline, and we're not agreeing to the publishing date until the entire thing is done because I'm not doing that again. But I am happy with the final product, but that part of it was not enjoyable.
Well, at least it was good enough that you would do it again.
There we go. Yeah.
Yeah. To end on a positive note. Well, Ben, it was great having you. Loved the stories and loved hearing what you had to say. All about, I guess, people analytics.
There we go.
Very fascinating. Thanks, Ben. I learned something new today.
Okay. There we go. And we've been successful.
Yes.
It's a good way to end a Friday.
Exactly.
Right. Thanks, Ben. Thanks, Rigvi.
This podcast was produced by Heartcast Media.